Okay, so the next topic we're going to be talking about is the Gini coefficient. So first of all, what it is, it's a way of measuring wealth inequality across a population. So I'm going to share my screen with you and show you what's going on here. But basically, this is a Lorenz curve. So if we're looking, this is measuring the number of people, right, within an economy by percent, right? And this is looking at the income, right, total income across that economy in percentages. So what we'd be looking at is, say, as an example, that, and then let's say here's what a line of absolute equality would be. So in this example, at 0% of the population would account for 0% of the cumulative share of income if it were at this point on the line. If it were about here, it would be about 50% of the people make up about 50% of the cumulative income, and all the way up to 100%. And this is what's known as a line, either the 45-degree line, or it's known as the line of perfect equality, right? And a Lorenz curve is essentially, it's in the least complicated way that I can explain it to you. Basically, a Lorenz curve is looking at, it's a function looking at how economic distribution occurs across a population. So they'll have different functions depending on the society, but the closer this Lorenz curve is to the 45-degree line, the closer it is to being equal, according to the Gini coefficient. And then what the Gini coefficient actually is when you take the area, so the distance, the space between the Lorenz curve and the line of equality, right? And you divide it by the total area under the line of line of equality. So it's A divided by A plus B in parentheses. And essentially, 1 would be perfectly unequal, because that would mean that it would be equal to the line of equality, because it would be the entire area. And then 0 would be perfectly equal. So you want it to be lower, generally speaking. Now, when we're looking at, let's say, you're a proponent of, free market, laissez-faire capitalism, right? And which most economies are mixed economies. That does not exist in the world currently, or ever really. But let's say you were, right? This economic inequality, like the reason measuring it matters is because it should still be a concern, because it lessens the ability of someone to succeed based on merit, right? While those greater means accrue, it incentivizes people to hoard wealth, right? So if there is a high amount of wealth inequality, then that means that there are a small group of people that are hoarding a lot of the wealth, right? If I am able to hoard wealth without being productive within an economy, then that is not a merit-based economy. It is disincentivizing me to work harder, because if I'm able to just hold on to that money, who cares, right? I'm just going to hold on to it. Then on top of that, it means there are less resources to go around within that community, which means that people at the bottom end of the economy don't have as much money, which if they don't have as much money to cover their cost of living necessities and then have extra money to spend, they aren't buying anything, which means that they can't stimulate the economy, right? Then on even more long-term, right, if people are able to just hoard wealth instead of having to work for it, then it's going to lead to less improvements in products and services, because less people are able to compete. Because if you don't have, as attractive as the idea of being an entrepreneur is, if you don't have extra time, or i.e. extra means to be able to pay for your cost of living while you're working on something else, you can't do it. So we need to have a certain regulation on wealth inequality getting too out of hand, even in a capitalist-driven society, right? And if we believe, if we're going to believe the common rhetoric that we hear, especially, in the U.S., that everyone has a chance at building wealth in the United States, then we should be able to measurably see that in data, right? And that's why looking at the Gini coefficient is important, because if we can look at that and see that, well, if everyone has a chance, then why isn't everyone doing it? Maybe there's a structural issue that we need to look at. So that's why it's important to look at measures like the Gini coefficient, in my opinion. Now, let's share some other perspectives on this and where the United States stands in terms of the Gini coefficient. So G7 nations are 7 of the most industrialized democracies in the world. And those nations are Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, the UK, and the US, right? And out of the G7 nations, the US is, according to the Gini coefficient, the highest wealth inequality, right? The highest income inequality, technically. They are 2 different things. And it's only gotten worse, right, in the US over the past several decades. And let me scoot this up for you. Yeah, and it's only gotten worse. So when we're looking, here is 1970, right? And this may be a complicated chart to read, but basically what we're looking at is, okay, middle income people, upper income, lower income. We're looking at, quartiles, so 25% measures. And what we're looking at is, okay, in 1970, middle income in the United States, the middle 50%, right, of people made up 62% of the aggregate income in the United States. That's pretty good, right? That means that the middle class was making more money than their percentile value, right? Because if 50% made 50%, that would be exactly equal. 62%, that's good. That means the middle income people are making a good amount of money relative, in total, relative to their part of the population. Upper income, and we can see that's dropped, right? Now it's below the 50 percentile mark, right? With upper income, we can see it's risen from 29% to 48%. This means 25%, right, was accounting for 29% of the income. Now 25% accounts for 48% of the income. It's past the middle income people, right? Lower income has basically been hosed the entire time, but has gotten even worse, right? So we can see that this is not going on a very good trend, right? These middle and lower income, the average people in the United States, their incomes keep falling while the upper incomes keep rising. So not only is the U.S. already one of the worst of the industrialized nations when it comes to wealth inequality, it's getting worse every year, right? For decades. That's only income. Now let's talk about wealth. So the difference is income is, of course, what you make per year, right? Wealth is how much you have accumulated over time, right? Wealth is much more of the indication of how rich you are. Because if you make, let's use a outlier example. Let's say you're an NFL running back and you make $20 million per year, but you only have a 3-year, you only have 3 years of a career. You're nowhere near as rich as a person that consistently, that is able to, say, buy a $10 million house and then, rent or a apartment complex and then rent out those units over time. The latter person is probably going to build more wealth because it's something that is sustainable over the long term and has growth potential. So that matters a lot more. When we're looking at wealth, here's the thing to look at, and this is a more complicated chart, but essentially what we're looking at is that from these time periods, from 1989 to 98, 98 to 07, and 07 to 2016. Now, why are these important dates? 1989, 2000. From 1989 to 2000, there was a big crash in 1987, so around that time. 2000, big crash, the dot-com bubble. 2007, of course, Great Recession. You get the idea. So this is kind of looking a little bit in those time frames of those economic cycles. And when we're looking here, what we can see is that we have the top 5%, right? This is how much, okay, they've gained in wealth since, during each time frame. And we can see the top 5% gained 75% in wealth during this time period. So that's dot-com bubble to 07 to 09 recession, right? Way outpacing everyone else. And then we can see the highest fifth, that means the highest 20% of earners, is that and the fifth are the only ones the only people who have gained wealth statistically in the United States since the Great Recession. Everyone else has lost wealth. It's a pretty sobering thing to think about. When you, especially you should be accruing wealth over time. Wealth should be gained over time. The stock market is up since then. It's not like everyone's 401ks just went down. Yeah. Let's look at a even more perspective, to think about historically. So, well, actually, let's look at this first. So this is income inequality with developed economies. So we can see a little bit more of a, idea of where the U.S. stands overall. And just so everyone's clear, the U.S. is about 37th in the world when it comes to income inequality as measured by the Gini coefficient. And we can see on here as an example, we have the United States, and we're going to be looking not before taxes and transfers because that's not really indicative. We're going to be looking at after taxes and transfers because, of course, taxes, public policies, those different specific policies are going to change drastically between countries. So if you're going to compare, in my opinion, you should be comparing after tax and transfer Gini coefficients, not before. Very important stipulation. So as we can see here, we're looking at, 3.8. So we can see Germany is a full, 10% below basically, because when these are converted to percents, you can see we're about the same as Israel. We're more than Italy, more than France. It's not looking good. When we're looking down here, who's doing the best? We can see, it's right here, 2.4. So Iceland, Norway. I know we hear a lot about them when it comes to dealing with income inequality, in the United States when we're talking about politics. When we look at Canada, it's better than the U.S. It's not as good as those, but you get the idea. This is just a good general place to look when we're looking at all of the overall, where the U.S. stands in the world currently. Now let's look historically, because we want to see, how do economic policies affect this, right? And this is definitely a example that is definitely to get you talking and thinking. So this is looking at, we're looking at what is the share of the top 10% in the United States versus, and this is over the last century, basically, a little over. And we're looking at, how does it change over time, right? And what we can see is we're comparing France, the U.S., and Russia. France is, generally speaking, a heavy social democratic country. So along the lines of what, say, someone like Bernie Sanders would support. Whereas, of course, the United States is, generally speaking, it's, of course, a mixed economy, but generally speaking, leans more towards the capitalist side. And then we, of course, have the USSR, which gives us a great example showing a feudal society, essentially, at the beginning of the 1900s to a, full communist society for a good portion of the 1900s. And then we see it return back to a, much more capitalist society reminiscent of the United States after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And I think it's really important to look at because when we're looking at this is not Gini coefficient. This is looking at percentage owned by the top 10%. So keep that in mind. But when we're looking at this, we can see that, the U.S., it was pretty bad in the 1920s, like really bad during the Roaring 20s, which over speculation in the market, of course, helped lead to the Great Depression. And we see everything come down, right? Well, then we're watching over time. And yeah, the New Deal, the Great Society in the 1960s, all that keeps the U.S. going down, right? So we're looking at, the income inequality, at least the amount of income held by the top 10% is going down. And then we notice around 1980, whenever we shift more towards the economic and fiscal and foreign policies that we've had since Reagan, both on the Democratic and the Republican side, we can see it has just steadily climbed, right? That's not a good thing, not if you care about income inequality. Now, France, we can see over time, it was bad. it dropped. It's been consistently generally dropping, but it's started to level off, right? And then when we look at the USSR, which is of course the best case example in my opinion, because it shows you the drastic swings. You have 1905, which is still when, the Tsar was in power. You see the big drop, and keep in mind that Russia was a feudal society pretty much at this point. You see this huge drop in the amount of income held by the top 10% following the revolution, of course. And then you see that it stays pretty low over time. Once it gets past the 1950s and 1960s, it's pretty low. It's not 10% and 10%. It's not perfect equality, but it was pretty low. And then you see as soon as the Berlin Wall comes down and Western capitalism comes into that country, it immediately shoots back up. And now the United States is actually past Russia, which it's something to think about. And it just gives you a perspective of how different economic policies have changed wealth inequality in these different countries across the last century and a half, basically. Now, to show why we have this change, or at least to display this change a little bit better from late 1970s, early 1980 onward in the United States, I have some other charts that I want to share with you guys. So this is where we're looking at, let me zoom this in. This is where we're looking at how income gains have changed over time, right? And this is looking at post-war, talking about post-World War II. The reason that's important is because that's when you had the New Deal and Franklin Delano Roosevelt's different public social safety net programs come in. And we want to see, okay, well, how have things changed, right? And so when we're looking at this, what we're wanting to see is who's benefited, right? And we can see, so that we're clear, 95th percentile, this means people that are making more than 95% of people, right? Median means people that are making more than 50% of people, so basically the average. And 20th percentile means people that are, the bottom 20% of income earners. And as we can see, this is looking at growth of each of those incomes. And we can see it's pretty on point with everyone. From those programs were pretty successful overall, those New Deal programs. You see that it stayed about, so were the Great Society programs. You see it stays pretty good all the way up until about 1975-ish. And then you start to see a bit of a departure. And you start to see that the 95th percentile, i.e. the top 5%, starts making more and more, and it grows more each year. Meanwhile, bottom 50, average person, and bottom 20, they say they move at about the same rate. So every time someone's making more, the top 5% is making more at a faster rate, which is only going to increase and further exacerbate that wealth inequality. When we're looking at, this is showing the income gains, and what we're looking at is, this is for income households, right? So this is since 1980, so a little bit more specific. And we can see it's insane. The top 1% gains compared to the bottom 20%, the next 19, it's pretty bad. So when we're looking, okay, top 1% as an example, this is of course the 99th percentile. So then we're talking about with the next 19, we're talking about the 80th percentile. We're talking about the middle 60%. This is going to be roughly the middle class in the United States. Middle class is generally the middle 50% of earners. And then the bottom 20%. All these guys are getting left behind. That's a pretty big issue if we're caring about wealth inequality. Then if we want to look at, okay, well, what's the distribution of income, right? And we want to see, okay, well, this is looking at before and after federal tax transfers. So we're going to look at after tax because that's what matters more. But let's say you hear people constantly talk about how the richest people pay the most taxes, right? So it's justified. Well, not really, because here's the problem, is when you look here, the top 1% of people, right, are only paying 16% of the taxes. Or at least only getting, they're only paying on 16% of the income. It's not that big of a deal, right? When we're looking at the shares of the pie, this is 1%. of people. This is 60% of people. They should be paying more. That's how the system should work. It should work even better, to be honest. And then when we're looking at, okay, well, what is the taxes they pay? Like, oh, they pay so much in taxes. Look at the difference. The difference in income distribution between pre-tax for the 1%, 16%. After, 13%. Where's the big difference? It's not there. It's a lie. They aren't. And oftentimes, because the fact that capital gains is taxed at a lower rate than earned income, oftentimes they pay less in taxes because of those loopholes. And a good example of that would be going back to the classic Warren Buffett line of how his secretary pays more in taxes percent-wise than he does, and talking in the 2012 election, whenever Romney was talking about how he pays only like 11% in taxes. Yeah, it's something to keep in mind when we're talking about wealth inequality and how to fix that. Now, then we're looking at wealth. So wealth is even more of a problem. Like I said before, wealth is more important because it has to do with what you have access to, i.e. how big of loans you can get, right? Look at, like, it's insane. So here's income, right? Bottom 90% keeps about 50%. After taxes, bottom 90% keeps about 23%. The top 1% grew. That's because they're paying less. That's because they're paying less in taxes. That's ridiculous. So anytime someone says that, oh, well, they pay higher rates, so they pay more into the system, they should. They use more of the system. They have way more of the system. And that is always going to cause a big problem within any economy, but it's even going to cause a problem in an economy that wants to be aggressively capitalist, because it's going to end up where you have people that are hoarding money, people that aren't spending money, and it's going to stagnate the economy. And that's why you always see cyclical climbs and crashes every about 4 to 7 years. It's like clockwork. We've had 3 in the last 20 years. It's just an inevitability of this type of a system. So then the question is, well, what can we learn, right? So from this, we can see that the U.S. currently is very unequal, right? And is not serving the interests of the working class. And I think the goal and the point that we should take away from this is that we need to push for policies that will help fix this inequality. And good examples of that, from my perspective, are higher marginal tax rates on top income earners, i.e., the people that are making the most should be paying more into the system. Generally speaking, they're using more of the system. As an example, Jeff Bezos owning Amazon. Amazon uses roads and other public services way more than I or you do. They should be paying a higher percentage. They're using it at a higher rate. Not complicated. Not to mention the carbon output of those companies versus, the average person, and what that effect has on the taxpayer long term, as well as just livelihood of anyone on the earth. But then also another thing to keep in mind is we should have a much higher estate tax and at a lower bracket. Currently, the estate tax, or the death tax in the United States, only starts at $11.58 million on an individual, or $23.6 million jointly. And then it's only taxed at 40%, which to me is silly. For perspective, under Obama, it was taxed starting at $3 million, not at 11.58. And basically what that means is that if you die with $12 million and leave that to your kids, then only the last 0.5% basically will be taxed at 40%. In my opinion, that's completely antithetical to suggesting that we live in a merit-based society, because if you need to worry about getting 3 million even, or 11.6 million like it is now, in order to get by, then you probably shouldn't be wasting those resources, because they could be better used to help other people in society. And I think we need to remove exemptions like the stepped up tax basis. The stepped up tax basis is basically looking at when you buy, and I did a video on this in Biden's tax plan, breaking it down. So check that out if you want a more thorough explanation. But basically, it has to do with how property is taxed based on inheritance. And essentially, if you buy something that, a piece of real estate generally, that accrues interest over time and grows in value, and then you die and you give it to your kids, then they will only be taxed on the amount that it gained since they were given it, not since it was purchased, which essentially means that the person who purchased it, you, before giving it to your kids, saved all that money tax-free gains, which there's no reason to incentivize that, in my opinion, in the United States. We have artificial scarcity in housing already anyway. That only benefits. And on top of that, we got to keep in mind that, again, the level of wealth that's required to even get to that point is in the millions. Most people in the United States, or anywhere really, but most people in the United States end up dying very poor, if not completely broke. This doesn't benefit the average person. I also think that we need to tax investment income at the same rate as labor income, right? i.e. capital gains tax should be taxed at the same rate as earned income, because to me, it's a travesty that a person working, an industrial job, as an example, pays the same income rates as a person who is, a trust fund kid picking stocks on Robinhood. That's pretty pathetic. And they're getting taxed lower. Why would we incentivize that? That's not adding productivity to our economy, which, generally speaking, should be the goal of an economy, is to add productivity to make the economy, produce more to better serve the society that it's a part of. And then we need to invest more in social programs that benefit everyone. Whether that's education, other social safety net programs. We need to make sure that people have equal opportunities. And the best way to do that is to help fund programs that, produce those. And the other one we really need is, and this is something that, individuals have to do, is we need better labor power within companies. I know that for me, working in companies that were heavily unionized was a really big benefit. And I'll do a video on that as well pretty soon, talking about like how it is that, you people that are that work at unionized companies make about 20% more than non-unionized companies. The selling of the idea of right to work being a good program for working class people, and the union busting that's been happening over the last, especially the last 3-4 decades, has been terrible for the average working class person. And we need to remember that, that's something we can do within our own, jobs. And then we need to, just call it for what it is. You need to call the system for what it is. It's not meritocratic. I mean, I think we all can agree that no matter what our individual experience is, I think we can all agree that the hardest working people don't necessarily, and oftentimes do not, make more because of that. And I have a problem with that. So I think most people do in their gut. I think that's something that we should look at, and we need to just look at, okay, and everyone's perspective is different, but you should look at, well, what is the goal of an economic system? And I personally don't think that ours is fulfilling that at this time. And I think the Gini coefficient is a good starting point of understanding why it isn't. If you enjoyed this clip, be sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out the full live version of the Wealth for 99 podcast, where we talk finance, economics, and public policy from a working class perspective. We'll see you there.